Tonya Davidson. I'm a prof here in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. In the spring of 2021, a number of us in the department got together and put together a lecture series on how to make sense of the pandemic through the lens of sociology and anthropology. And the series included lectures on anti-Asian racism and the pandemic, how the pandemic's impacting incarcerated populations, how it's being experienced in some parts of Africa, the future of work, long-term care homes, and the impact of the pandemic on seasonal traditions. So we've put together some clips from that series here, so you can get a taste of what goes on in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology.
With pandemics like COVID, as well as with other large-scale catastrophes or local catastrophes like earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods, the people impacted in the worst ways tend to be people who are already socially disadvantaged. So, for example, people who are poor or homeless, racialized minorities, indigenous people. So I don't know what my colleagues are going to be talking about, but I imagine this theme is going to come up repeatedly. So the pandemic and other catastrophes tend to magnify the effects of social inequality. So people are already in an unequal situation, and the pandemic catastrophes make that worse.
And this, I think, is the Trojan horse for people who want to work remotely. A lot of people want to stay working remotely. I think that's dangerous. If employees no longer need to be in the office, why hire expensive local labor with all of its legally required benefits, living salary, pensions, rights, and so on? Why not hire members of the precariat from countries with lower wages? Hire them as gig workers, assuming they have the qualifications for the job. Why not, instead of hiring a local person to do your computer programming for you, why not hire someone from Brazil who can do it online for half the salary? The precariat, then, I think, is the point at which gig workers and remote workers begin to merge together. And that, I think, is one of the dangers of the post-pandemic workplace.
The model minority myth, as I said earlier, this assumption that Asians, and in my case, my research focused on Chinese Canadians, they are successful, they have big houses, they have cars, and they are doing well. What problem could they have in their lives, right? And many Chinese Canadians think that way as well. But what's the problem here? The problem is that when you look at the poverty rate, you actually will see that different Asian Canadian groups, including Chinese Canadian group, has a high poverty rate, right? And when you dig into the data, you will see that Chinese Canadians are overrepresented in high income professional occupations as a result of immigration policy, right? The skilled immigrant program that deliberately targets to bring over highly trained, highly professional immigrants. So they are overrepresented in those occupations, but at the same time, they are also overrepresented in the lowest income strata.
The pandemic tells us a lot and actually reinforces a lot of what we are talking about in relation to the social meanings we put on seasonal traditions. So one thing I would encourage us to think about first is the huge public health anxiety. You could hear it in the doctors' voices whenever a holiday was coming up. Oh, Mother's Day. Oh, spring break. Oh no, oh God, it's Halloween. And the doctors are just like, please don't let this lead to a spike. So one of the things early on I realized, was thinking about, wow, we are so connected to our seasonal traditions that we will actually, risk the lives of our favorite people because that's how important Christmas is, or that's how important Mother's Day is. And so here's just one, study showed that over Christmas, despite the huge yelling at people to not do it, nearly half of Canadians, they could not resist their seasonal tradition of visiting their family for Christmas. One of the things that really came through in our work was that seasonal traditions and phenomenon do two things very well. They, on the one hand, are great expressions of the many, many ways that we collectively try to have what this old sociologist Emile Durkheim calls social solidarity. They really are clear expressions of people collectively, even with people you know, or in a broader society sense, really want opportunities to show that they belong to something bigger, right? And we see this so much with our so many seasonal phenomenon, like, seasonal parades and concerts and all of these things. So the seasonal traditions really offer these great opportunities for solidarity, and what Durkheim also called collective effervescence. He used the term collective effervescence to refer to that feeling beyond oneself that emerges when people are together engaged in something towards a common end. It's usually referring to something positive, but it can also be negative as well. So at hockey riots, for example, or hockey games, there's this energy, this collective energy is what he calls collective effervescence. And we see this in seasonal traditions. And this is something that we also see in some of our pandemic adaptations to seasonal traditions. And it can also be at the root of why we're so committed to things like holding on to seasonal traditions, even in the face of, huge threat to our own health.
Canadian sociologist Professor Pat Armstrong, who I've been so thrilled to have the chance to work with her, and she conducts these rapid ethnography site visits where we go for 4 days to a particular long-term care home with a team, and we do rapid research, meaning that we connect and learn and spend a full day. So some of us will start the shift at 6 a.m. to see what the morning shift are. Others, team members, will come in the afternoon. There will be some who work the night shift. And so we do this around the clock kind of site visits to visit long-term care facilities as a part of this team with her. And her saying is, conditions of work are conditions of care. So she really looks closely at how workers are treated or how care is organized shapes the conditions of care. She tried not to trademark it, but she really thinks of care as a relationship. And so there are some ideas of person-centered care. This reimagining long-term care research found, that doesn't always quite work. It needs to be equitable for workers and people who need support. And one of the concepts that we've been thinking about together is the right not to care. So, and not kind of in brackets. So, meaning that people should have a right to receive care and to have a choice in the care they receive. It should have the right conditions to be able to provide care, and should have choices about what kind of care they don't want, or what kind of care they don't want to provide. So all about having the public sector supports or conditions to make that happen.
It's important to situate the pandemic in global and national inequalities, particular power dynamics, cultural dynamics, to understand how it plays out very unevenly. I've just given you glimpses of different parts of Africa, but even as I hope you've seen, it has been playing out unevenly in different countries. Depends in part of the government responses, depends in part about the type of economic livelihood, depends on the role or lack thereof of community groups. And it's also important, to recognize the range of efforts by different Africans to assist and improve the situation. And then also, I'm but I meant to say this at the very beginning. And of course, it's important to look at places, to tackle the pandemic in Africa, like in Papua New Guinea and Brazil and everywhere else, because of course, as we live in an integrated world, so we all may have, get fully vaccinated, hopefully later this year. But nonetheless, people, if other parts like Africa, very few people are vaccinated, there's a greater chance of new variations emerging, which potentially, the vaccines which we all have aren't working against it. So it's extremely important to remind our government that they should be sending, not only sending more vaccines to Africa, but to support South Africa and India and getting rid of the TRIPS intellectual property rights, and support different African communities in trying to tackle COVID-19.